It's been a while since I've talked about what's going on in the world. And I thought now is a good time because I find some fascinating things happening right now. And the title of what I want to talk about is Hooray! World War III is over. The US won, of course, but who lost? So let me ask you, if we just had World War III just happen and finish, who did America just beat? What do you think? That's my question to you. Well, my answer to that question is Europe. Let's get into this. So, first thing I want to go through previously, about a couple months ago, I went through something I called 10 Harsh Realities Shaping Our Future. And I just wanted to pick out three of them that I thought were interesting. The first one was Europe, and especially Germany, is destroying itself. Germany and Europe had no reason to stop oil and gas from Russia. In fact, they had been increasing commercial relationships. Germany's transition to green energy didn't produce the energy needed to replace their wind down of fossil fuel and nuclear power. And rising energy prices are likely to cripple German industry and consumer. I'll talk about that a little bit more detail coming up. The fourth of the 10 harsh realities was this is a US-Russia showdown, not a Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's pretty clear now, and the US sees Russia as its arch enemy and has been closing in on it since 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union. The US and its proxy, NATO, come on. US controls NATO, right? Does any European country control NATO? If European countries wanted to do something different from what the US wanted to do with NATO, could they do it? Highly unlikely. They've been attempting to surround Russia by bringing Russia bordering Georgia and Ukraine into NATO since 2008. Don't be deceived by US's concern for Ukraine. It's a show. US obviously is going after Russia. Number 9, mass refugee migration leads to social unrest in the countries that are receiving these refugees. Europe, mainly Germany, has been absorbing refugees from U.S. conflicts. Wait a minute, from what? Yes, from U.S. conflicts. The conflict started particularly in the Middle East, where the U.S. has stirred the pot for a long time. Those refugees have been going. U.S. Democrats are also allowing a huge migration across the southern border. In April of 2022, more than 250,000 people entered the U.S. illegally over the southern border. And that's not an exceptional day or month. In fact, it's more than 2 million people that have gone across the southern border. Now, I'm all for migration, but obviously this is massive. And it's the highest in a single month in recorded U.S. history. And it's a 1,376% increase from the April 2020 numbers under the Trump administration. The next thing is famine is likely to increase migration flows from Africa to Europe. Now, I wanted to also talk a little bit more detail about this U.S. dominance over Europe. It's now complete, in my opinion. There's been World War III, U.S. won, Europe lost. Sorry about that. So, this Russia-Ukraine conflict has accelerated U.S. dominance over Europe. Military dominance, almost all countries now have joined NATO. Political dominance, there's no dominant power in the EU in politics right now. Cultural power, well, mass migration, you'll see, or immigration, has caused upheavals. Financial, we'll talk about the global SWIFT system, and energy dependent on imports. Well, let's look at it first and talk about military dominance. Here you can see that Al Jazeera published this a while ago, showing that U.S. has more than 60,000 troops in Europe, half of which are in Germany, a third of which are in Italy and the U.K. The U.S., obviously, with what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, basically makes the U.S. even more desirous, and maybe the Europeans more desirous too, to have more U.S. military resources in Europe. U.S. operates more than 200 military bases in Europe. Here, in fact, we can see that those military bases are all across Europe. Of course, we know they are all across the world. The US has 750 bases in at least 80 countries and 173,000 troops deployed across 159 countries. You see this map and you think to yourself, who's trying to dominate the world? China or someone else? You make your own decision on that. Now, here we can also see that Finland and Sweden also interested in joining NATO, and that just brings everybody into NATO. And these are the NATO countries, obviously in blue. Non-NATO countries, well, there's some of them, and there's some micro countries, but basically almost every country now in Europe is either in NATO or desirous to be in NATO. So NATO membership means Europeans participate as peacekeepers in U.S. conflicts. That was Kuwait, Iraq, 1990, Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1992, Kosovo in 1999, Afghanistan in 2003, and that went on, of course, for 20 years, Iraq in 2004, Somalia in 2009, and Libya in 2011. The fact is that once they're in NATO, they are going to support U.S. wars. Now, this is a clip that I published this a while ago when I was talking with my clients. It was showing in 2018, Trump raised the issue of Germany's energy dependence on Russia. And here's how it went.
Germany is totally controlled by Russia because they will get it from 60 to 70% of their energy from Russia and a new pipeline. And you tell me if that's appropriate, because I think it's not. And I think it's a very bad thing for NATO, and I don't think it should have happened. And I think we have to talk to Germany about it.
NATO is an alliance of 29 nations, and there are sometimes differences and different views and also some disagreements. And the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany is one issue where allies disagree. But the strength of NATO is that despite these differences, we have always been able to unite around our core task to protect and defend each other because we understand that we are stronger together than one.
But Germany, as far as I'm concerned, is captive to Russia because it's getting so much of its energy from Russia. So we're supposed to protect Germany, but they're getting their energy from Russia. Explain that. How do you have to explain, you know?
And I would just mention that this is an interesting discussion. Now, for me, I'm all for trade between countries rather than war. I would much rather have trade. And therefore, I'm not for what Trump is saying to break off from Russia and Germany. But what Trump's really saying is, why should America put money into NATO if Germany is getting all of this gas from Russia? Let's continue on and look at a couple of other points. In the political sphere, of course, the absence of Angela Merkel and her coalition's political leadership in Europe has allowed the U.S. to fill the gap, for example, forcing Germany to cut off Russian oil and gas supply, as well as Europe. European political leaders will find it hard to oppose the U.S. What political leader in the U.S. or in Europe right now is going to stand up and tell the U.S., no, I don't agree with this? Tell me. Maybe Italy? We'll talk about that later. Nord Stream 2 was meant to deliver as much as 70% of Germany's gas needs. And Germany exited the nuclear power plants that they had in 2011 and coal-fired plants in 2019. In fact, here is Leonhard Birnbaum, who says he's the CEO of Germany's biggest gas and electricity provider, who said, it is utopian to believe that Russian gas can be completely replaced from one day to the next by other sources. So here you can see cultural dominance. This is a map that shows the European migrant crisis at the time. In 2015, Syrian refugees crisis caused about 1.3 million people to arrive in Europe to request asylum. What caused this crisis? What caused the collapse of Syria and Libya and all the other countries? It wasn't Europe meddling in their affairs. It was, of course, the US, the most in a single year since World War II. Not just Syrians, but also Afghans, Nigerians, and others who saw an opportunity and an open border. And of course, if you look at this map, what you see on this, and this is a critical point, is this particular line, which I'm going to circle right here, is the people that were going into Italy. And that can stir up trouble in Italy. And these crises, like the 2015 Syrian crisis, had to do with Obama's wars. And of the asylum seekers from the Syrian crisis, well, they came from the Syrian war, the Afghan war, the Iraq war, the Somalia war. All are these destabilizing activities by the U.S. 51% went to Germany, 10% to France, 9% to Italy, and 7% to Sweden. And here we can see that more than 7.4 million refugees have left Ukraine. About 8 million people have been displaced within Ukraine. And of course, there are some people that are fleeing to Russia. But that is a big numbers. Countries that received Ukrainian refugees: Germany, 29%, Czech Republic, 14%, Bulgaria, 10%. This is a massive migration. Now, when this war conflict is over, I suspect that a portion of these people will go back to Ukraine, but plenty of them will remain in Europe. So again, a cultural inflow of, I would say, not that the movement of migrants is bad or immigrants is bad. It's just that you have to accept that it causes some sort of cultural disruption with the existing order. Let's talk about financial dominance that the US has now over Europe. Here we can see a table. I showed the economies of the different regions, and we can see that the US economy is 24% of America's, China's 19% of Asia, but there's no country in Europe that is that stands out from a GDP perspective. It is a very broad amount of breakdown of GDP. So Merkel's strong leadership is gone with nothing to replace it. Germany's economy is weakened from this crisis. And basically, let's talk also about the SWIFT system. Now, that was a while ago when they kicked Russia off of the SWIFT system. But also the point is that this SWIFT action that happened is just more indication of the tools, the financial tools and other tools that the U.S. is going to use and will use in this war. And also we know that China has the cross-border interpayment system, which they set up in 2015 as a settlement and payment clearing system for transactions that use the Chinese yuan. And the U.S. is just pushing Russia and other non-aligned countries into the arms of the Chinese, of course. It's supervised by China's central bank. And SWIFT is a messaging system, whereas CHIPS is a settlement system for renminbi transactions that also offers some communication function. Now, let's talk about energy. Russia is the heart of European energy. Without it, Europe will find it hard to grow. Here is a map that shows the oil and gas pipelines coming from Russia. And the oil pipelines are the darker, the red lines, and the green is the gas pipelines. You can see, I put this down like the heart. I took this picture from National Geographic, and I basically overlaid the picture of a heart. With the cutoff of Russian gas to Europe, it is a very devastating blow to Europe. The U.S. has forced Europe to ban oil and gas imports from Iran since 2018 U.S. sanctions, and Germany has succumbed to U.S. pressure to cut off Nord Stream 2 project. You can see back in February, German Chancellor Scholz halted the approval process for Nord Stream 2 and said he will reassess. Now we've seen that that's been shut down. And the U.S. has started to substitute 10% of Russian gas supply to Europe. Now, I want to look at a particular chart that shows a production indicator. And if it's above 100, it demonstrates the ability to export. And below 100 means that they have to import. This chart was provided by the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. And basically, if you look at it and you look at the Commonwealth of, I forget what CIS stands for. You can remind me in the chat. But the Commonwealth of Independent States, I believe it is, but that is the Russian Federation, basically. And we can see that it's massively high, meaning it's an exporter. We can also see the Middle East is a major exporter. The U.S. is not an exporter. In fact, it's making just enough to cover its own needs. And of course, Europe is an importer. And without Russia and without the Middle East, Europe is going to be in trouble, and the U.S. cannot completely fill that gap. So what's the points that I'm making? Since the end of World War II, the U.S. steadily increased its influence in Europe, and now it's complete. World War III is done. Europe lost. U.S. won. The Russia-Ukraine situation allowed the U.S. to achieve military, political, cultural, financial, and energy dominance over Europe. And Russia's key strength, of course, is its massive energy reserves. And the bottom line is the U.S. forced Europe to sever its relationships with Russia. And what I would say is, where is World War IV coming now? Why is it so important to control Europe? Well, because America has a much bigger target, and they know that India and Africa and other countries in the Middle East are not going to go along with them, so they need Europe. The U.S. is using economic power to force countries to take sides. With Europe complete, the next target is Asia. The U.S. is testing whether China bows to U.S. political, military, and economic pressure that's happening right now. And here you can meet Julianne Smith. She's a U.S. permanent representative to NATO from the U.S. She's framed Russia's invasion as a failed country takeover and it set up Asia to take sides. She was recently in Asia. She said both Russia and China are threats to the rules-based international order. It's been interesting for me to watch countries in the Asia-Pacific talk about hybrid threats on their side of the Pacific, how they are grappling with disinformation, cyber attacks, and aggressive tactics, that they're seeing acts of intimidation from China. So what somebody said, somebody said to me a while ago, Andrew, if America wants to go to war with China, how is it that America is going to do that? Because many countries are not going to get involved in that. And pretty simple. It's the same thing that they did in past wars, is that they're going to go to countries like Thailand, where I am right now, and say, hey, you're either on our side or you're on the enemy's side. Which one are you going to pick? And that's enough for a lot of countries to have to choose to be with the U.S., unfortunately. So here we can see that Russia's economy is not more than the combined size of Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Russia does not constitute an economic threat to the U.S. And the idea that Russia has the economic resources, for instance, to take over Europe is a very hard case to make, though Russia has some leverage thanks to its resource richness. Now, also, let's think about Russia militarily. Russia spends about $66 billion per year on the military. It's tiny compared to the $800 billion that the U.S. So is Russia a military threat? I think that's hard to say. It's more likely that the U.S., with $800 billion in spending on defense, is probably a bigger threat to the world. The U.S. is using the situation and its economic power to force countries to take sides. Of the global population, about 32.1% remain neutral, and 27.6% are Russia-leaning. Whoa. So everybody's not on board with America, and this is why America needs to dominate Europe, so that Europe goes along when the U.S. goes after China. And here we can see that the U.S., if we look at which countries have sanctioned Russia, whoa, as of the time of this particular chart when it came out, this was March. So I'm just going to highlight that basically all of Asia, Africa, and South America have not been sanctioning as of that time. That's fascinating. And here we can see that when the UN General Assembly vote denounces Russia over Ukraine invasion, which happened a while ago, 5 were against, 35 abstained, and 12 were absent. That is not unanimous. And here we can see that after Europe is complete, U.S. will try to gain dominance over the Asian region. We can get a little picture of the countries that are aligned with the U.S., meaning the blue countries in particular that have been aligned, whereas the green countries on this map, coming from Big Think, the green countries on this map are the ones that kind of have worked both sides, like in my case, where I am, Thailand. So what's the conclusions from this? Russia's economy and military is too weak to constitute a real serious threat to the U.S. I expect the U.S. to force countries to choose sides and aim to dominate in Asia as it has in Europe. Bottom line, U.S. is accelerating a bipolar world order and will bring pain and on countries that choose to oppose it. So I'm going to stop at that point and just briefly talk about it. Of course, if there's any questions or opinions, feel free to share them. My main point that I'm making is that World War III just happened, and it was the U.S. against Europe. Now, why is this interesting in the current context? Well, what just happened in Italy? We saw an Italian government come in that could potentially challenge what the US is doing in Europe. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them. Hillary, great to see you. You said, what was the rumor of China coup all about? Well, of course, we know in China that Xi Jinping has all the power at the top, and he's not going to last forever. And the fact is that with a country that size and that much at stake and a lot of things going wrong, zero COVID policy was very tough, the housing market collapsing, you can imagine that political opponents are jockeying within the Chinese political system. And the result is that people are probably anticipating the day when it eventually happens. Now, whether he can just step down one day in 1 year, 5 years, whenever, or whether he'll be squeezed out, that's another issue. But I would just say that tensions are high there. And that's the reason why I say that. Now, feel free to ask any more questions. Gunnar says, hi, Andrew, any thoughts regarding Taiwan? Now, here again is America has a one China policy, and that is basically acknowledging Taiwan relative to China. And in fact, acknowledging, and this was done under Kissinger and Nixon when they normalized relationships with China. And so up until this point, America hasn't gotten into the debate very much. They support Taiwan, but also they've been friendly with China for a long time now, particularly economically. Now, personally, I think that you have a huge faction within the US government, both Democrat and Republican, that think they want to mess with China right now. Now, imagine, Gunnar, if you were on top of the hill at the playground when we were young and you're on the top, everybody's coming after you. And some group of kids or one kid starting to gain power and they're starting to come up that hill. You want to kick them before they get up to the top and then fight you at the top of that hill. So I believe that there's some politicians in America that think that now's the time to fight China in some way or another before they get bigger. Unfortunately, the reality is the US has even declared on the Department of Defense's website that China is the #1 threat for the US. And it was such a sad day, in my opinion, when I saw that on the website. I didn't even believe it, but I saw it on there. I took a clip of it, and it really bothered me because I just feel like China could have been America's #1 ally. But many years ago, America came up with the idea of the TPP program and Trans-Pacific Partnership, and they were going to set up trade with countries in Asia except China. And when I saw them exclude China, I thought that the neocons really were at it again in America. All right, next question. Okay, so Awad Pandey, India's position in the future of Asia. I think India's position actually is rising, and India's been pretty good at playing kind of, let's say, somewhat peacefully and not posing a threat to the US. Now, the problem that it's going to face is that if this continues to escalate, as I believe the US is trying to do, then they're going to put India on the back foot if they can. Even the importing of oil from Russia, the US didn't like to see that. So from my perspective, US wants India to go along, but I think India has got the best argument I think I've ever seen was the Indian finance minister, I believe it was, who bought the oil at a really low price from China. He was like, my job as a politician is to protect my people. And if there's an opportunity to get low cost oil, I'm going to take it. And so I think it's fascinating. And certainly India has been rising across Asia. And one thing, Awad, is that I saw when I first came to Thailand 30 years ago, we had almost no Indian tourists. And now it's a huge volume of Indian tourists that come here. So, yes. All right. And Hillary said, yeah, that was the foreign minister of India. And it really was. So what was his name? Was this his name? Jai Shankar. It was a great little presentation. Now, I just want to also highlight that one of the things that's happening in the US, it's happening less in in Asia, but it's happening everywhere, is the control of the media. And it's very critical that in the US right now that they can shut down any Russian news that's coming in off of any news station or news channel. And so that's an interesting thing, because basically when I talk to my friends in the US, it's like they are not allowed to get both sides of the story. And I'm not here to say that Russia is right or the US is right or Russia's wrong and the US is wrong. What I know from my life is that everything ultimately comes down to what my mom always said: there's two sides to every story. And so what I would say is that we need to listen to both sides in order to come up with some conclusions. So one way of listening to both sides is Sergei Lavrov just did a press conference after the UN meeting. It's published on the UN's YouTube channel. You just go to the United Nations YouTube channel and you'll be able to listen to it. It's about an hour that's translated, and it gives you that side of the story. And I think that ultimately, to stop what's happening in this world, what we need is talks. And that brings me to my last point. There's one party in this world that could stop this aggression that's happening, and that is the US. Now, of course, the US could do it through militarily attacking Russia. But what a disaster. What's that going to bring on the world? Like nuclear war. But the US could also do it by talking to the Russians, and they just refuse to do that. And so that's a bit of a problem from my perspective. Oh, wow. Gunnar said, Trump trade war was the start of escalating conflict between US and China and the end of globalization, which caused global inflation. Also, Trump wanted to bring back US troops from Asia and give China room to move forward. Happy to hear your view on that. And let me just see if I can see that. From my perspective, having lived in Asia for 30 years and watched the trade that was going on, I don't like what Trump did, because I felt like that ultimately trade and free trade brings peace. It doesn't bring war. Politicians bring war. And so my point is, I didn't like that. And it would have been much better if Trump and China had sat down and talked. And that's my first perspective. But now we live in this situation where the supply chains have been severed. And then you add the US COVID reaction and the world's COVID reactions, all of these governments shutting down. All of a sudden you sever all the communications and the communications and also all of the trade lines. And so now we've got, globalization has definitely been knocked back. And personally, I don't like that, because again, I think that trade brings peace ultimately, and that we can work things out through talking. So ultimately, I would also say that the chart that I showed, the map I showed of US bases in Europe and across the world, shows that it's the US that's really has a presence across the world. So the idea that China is trying to take over Asia, as an example, I don't buy that as much. Does China want to get resources for their country? Yes, definitely. Hillary says, yeah, Zero Heads, John Meschmeimer, and Mike Chernovich are good resources, as you say, for other perspectives. Yes, I agree. And I've listened and watched some of that. And can you comment about the World Economic Forum's plan for America? Yeah, I mean, I just don't know what the heck's going on in America, but I would say that the World Economic Forum has been raising its profile and its power. And I think that there's certain people in America that would go along with that. I think there's a large number of people. Now, of my LinkedIn users particularly, I asked the question, is the World Economic Forum a force for good or a force for bad? And majority of people said bad. So I think people are waking up to it. But in America, I don't know. They may now the one advantage that America has in this case is that America is not a democracy. America is a union of states, 50 states in particular. And if any one state wants to run itself one way versus another state, it can do it as long as it doesn't violate any particular major laws that are promulgated from the Congress out of the federal government. And so I would say that the hope that America has is that it can do things differently state by state. All right. Let's also look at the next one. The U.S. war against Iraq and Afghanistan was a real reason is oil or control terrorism? Well, I think if we look at, there's a lot of publications and releases of documents from the U.S. government that pretty much shows that the U.S. had an interest in destabilizing the Middle East. I was talking to a guy whose father worked for the CIA. He's long passed, but his father worked in Asia and across the world in the CIA at a pretty high level. And his son, who's an older man now, I asked him, what is the foreign strategy, for America across the world? And he said, misery. And I start to believe that that's the goal of America, is just to cause misery across the world. And when you destabilize everybody and everybody's screwed, well, the US dollar goes up and the US looks like a hero. I'm sad to say that that looks to me like what's happening. I've got to run to another meeting. I want to thank you guys for listening and for giving your feedback. Feel free to put more comments and ideas into the comment section. I love the questions, and I hope that I provide some answers. And yeah, Hillary says, as I end it, let's end it by saying that one of the CIA's top directives is energy. And so definitely energy and destabilization of the Middle East and other places that are sources of energy. Well, that's probably the end game. And I'll come back on live and talk about where I think World War IV is going to be. And it's not where you think. So great to see you guys. Let's have an amazing day and week ahead. And let's remember, let's bring peace. Let's bring communication. Let's bring talk. Sit down with the people that you would disagree with and try to work it out. The world deserves peace. Amen.